The year 1889 was a thirsty one in the Montana Territory, in the town of Silver Butte. Autumn arrived not with a cool whisper, but with a dry, rasping breath that kicked up the red dust and spun it down the main street. The dust settled on everything. A fine grit on the windows of the mercantile, and a dull coat on the unpainted boards of the church. The only sounds that seemed to cut through the heat were the steady, rhythmic clang of a hammer from old Ben's smithy, the dutiful toll of the church bell calling the faithful and the nervous, incessant chatter of the telegraph key from the post office, tapping out news of a world far from the concerns of dwindling wells. Caleb Mercer felt the drought in his bones. At 32, he moved with the quiet economy of a man who had learned to conserve everything, from words to motion. He stood at the edge of his pasture, his gaze tracing the faint, sad line of Willow Creek. It was more a memory of water than a current, a series of stagnant pools connected by damp earth. His horses, a small but sturdy herd, dropped their heads to lip at the browning grass. A former frontier scout, Caleb carried the past like a second shadow, a weight of battles seen and choices made that had left a permanent mark on his soul. There was a debt he could never repay, a silence he had kept when he should have spoken, and it had followed him from the high plains to this small horse ranch. Now, his world had shrunk to a single, pressing goal keep his pasture from turning to dust and his horses from going thirsty through the winter. He saw the wagon coming from a long way off, a dark shape crawling through the haze near Coyote Pass. It was the new schoolteacher's rig, piled high with books and slates and all the tools required to shape young minds. Her name was Evelyn Hart. He'd only seen her once, a brief nod in town. She was 28, with a way of holding herself that suggested a spine made of iron, though her voice was as soft as the undersides of the cottonwood leaves that now rustled like paper in the dry wind. She was, he'd heard, a photographer as well, a traveler who captured moments in a wooden box set on a tripod. She was an outsider, a temporary fixture like a puddle after a rare storm, and Silver Butte watched all outsiders with a collective, cautious squint. What Caleb didn't know, what no one knew, was that Evelyn Hart was a name she had chosen as carefully as she chose her lenses. She was born Evelyn Vale, a name that was now a liability. Her brother, Jasper, was a wanted man, his face on posters that claimed he had stolen a railroad payroll. She knew, with a certainty that was the bedrock of her existence, that Jasper had been framed. She was here not just to teach, but to listen, to watch, and to find the proof that would clear his name. The town's troubles, and Evelyn's, had a name: Silas Crow, a man in his 40s with a smile that never reached his eyes. Crow was the supervisor for the railroad spur and the owner of the new private dam being built upstream. He moved through Silver Butte not like a resident, but like a man surveying his assets. He twisted town ordinances and whispered in the right ears, his ambition a slow poison seeping into the community. His plan was simple and brutal: choke off Willow Creek with his dam, and when the ranchers and farmers grew desperate enough, buy their land for pennies on the dollar. As Caleb watched Evelyn's wagon approach the pass, two riders spurred their horses from a rocky outcrop. They wore burlap sacks over their heads, rough masks against the world. He saw the lead horse of her team rear up, heard the faint cry of alarm carry on the wind. He was moving before he had made a conscious decision, his own horse eating up the dry ground, the familiar weight of the rifle in his saddle scabbard a grim comfort. By the time he reached them, the men were trying to pull a heavy crate from the back of her wagon. Evelyn stood her ground beside the wagon wheel, her hands empty but her posture defiant. She wasn't screaming. She was watching. Caleb didn't shout. He didn't have to. He pulled up, the rifle resting easy across his lap. "That looks like school property," he said, his voice level. The two men froze, through the eye holes in their masks. He could see the panic. They were amateurs, clumsy and loud. They exchanged a look, then dropped the crate and scrambled back onto their horses, disappearing into the same rocks they'd come from. Caleb dismounted and walked toward her. "Ma'am," "Are you all right?" "I am," she said, her voice steady, though he saw the slight tremor in her hands. She pushed a stray strand of hair from her face. They seemed more interested in that crate than my purse. He looked at the heavy box of new textbooks. It seemed a strange target for thieves. Then he noticed the camera in her hands. She had already uncapped the lens. With a calm, deliberate motion, she slid a plate into the device, aimed it at the crate where it lay in the dust, and released the shutter. The click was a small, precise sound in the vast silence. "Might be useful," she said, more to herself than to him. "One never knows." She packed the plate away with the care of a jeweler handling a diamond. He helped her reload the crate, his hands brushing hers. Hers were cool, despite the heat. He noticed a faint chemical scent on her fingers, the smell of her other trade. When the crate was secure, he lingered for a moment. "They won't be back," he assured her. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer," she said, meeting his gaze directly. Her eyes were the color of a deep, clear creek, the kind he was starting to forget existed. Back in town, the incident was the talk of the general store. It was a strange sort of robbery. Everyone agreed. Sheriff Nora Bell, a woman whose badge seemed as natural on her as a wedding ring on another, took Evelyn's statement. Nora was a fair woman, but she had a pragmatist's weariness. Sounds like someone wanted to spook you more than rob you. Miss Hart, she concluded. The incident was soon overshadowed by the two events consuming Silver Butte, the upcoming Harvest Fair and the Water Board hearing. The fair was a rare chance for joy, a time for fiddle music and pumpkin pies. It's one unbreakable rule, a tradition started by Reverend Amos Hale and his wife Hattie, was that no child stands alone. It was a simple creed that bound them, a reminder that they were a community, responsible for one another. The Water Board hearing, however, was a source of deep anxiety. It was where Silas Crow would present his case for control of the dam, and everyone knew the board was already in his pocket. The day after the attempted robbery, a summons arrived for Evelyn. It was from Silas Crow, requesting her presence to give a formal deposition about the incident. It was an official-looking document, but the intent was clear. Tully Pike, Crow's thick-necked enforcer, delivered it with a sneer. "Mr. Crow likes to keep his railroad routes safe. He'll need to see your papers." Of course, for the record. Caleb was across the street, talking horseshoes with old Ben, the blacksmith. Ben's one good eye saw more than most men's two. He watched Pike leave the schoolhouse and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Crows sniffing around her like a coyote circling a chicken coop. Caleb saw the curtains twitch in the windows along the street. He saw the whispers exchanged between neighbors, the sideways glances at the schoolhouse door. Evelyn Hart, the stranger, was now a person of interest, a disruption. Something hardened in his gut. He had stood by silently once before in his life and watched injustice unfold. He wouldn't do it again. He walked across the street and knocked on the schoolhouse door. Evelyn opened it. Her face was composed, but he saw the tension in her jaw. "I heard about the summons," he said simply. "Silas Crow likes to make people feel small, especially people who are new to town." He paused. "I'm on my way to the sheriff's office to vouch for you, to state for the record that you're the teacher for our children and you have the town's support." A flicker of surprise, of something else he couldn't name, passed through her eyes. "You don't know me, Mr. Mercer." "I know you stood your ground when two men tried to take your property. That's enough for me." He tipped his hat. "Good day, Miss Hart." Later that afternoon, he found himself leading a lame mare past the schoolhouse. He had no real reason to take that route, but he took it anyway. Through the clean glass of the window, he saw the children at their desks. He saw Evelyn standing beside a small girl with braids who was staring at a book, her knuckles white. The girl's shoulders were shaking. Caleb stopped, staying out of sight. He watched as Evelyn knelt beside the girl, not touching her, but bringing herself to the child's level. He couldn't hear her words, but he saw her place a gentle hand on her own chest, Then tap it lightly. She seemed to be speaking in a soft rhythm. The little girl watched, then slowly placed her own small hand on her chest. She took a deep breath. Evelyn nodded, a small, encouraging smile on her face. A moment later, the girl began to read. Her voice was hesitant at first, a tiny thread of sound, but it grew stronger, word by word, until it filled the quiet classroom. Caleb stood there for a long time, watching the lesson continue. He saw not just a teacher, but a woman of deep, principled kindness, a woman who knew that courage wasn't about the absence of fear, but about finding your rhythm in the middle of it. He was turning to leave when old Ben's voice startled him. The blacksmith had come up beside him, silent as a shadow. "Saw you watching," Ben said, his good eye fixed on Caleb. Caleb felt a flush of heat rise to his neck. "Just checking on the schoolhouse shutters? Wind's been rough." Ben grunted, a sound of disbelief. He nodded his head toward the low hills, where the silhouette of Crow's new construction scarred the horizon. "Heard you spoke up for her." "It was the right thing to do." "Right and easy ain't always the same path," Ben said, his voice dropping lower. He leaned on the fence post, his gaze distant. "You know, Crow's building that new dam right on the old creek bed, the one that's been dry for 50 years but holds the deep spring." Caleb felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Ben continued, his voice barely a whisper. "My grandfather told me about that spring. It never runs dry. Never. Crow is about to bury it under 1,000 tons of rock and timber. When he does, the water's about to disappear for good." Caleb's gaze shifted from the dam back to the schoolyard. The lesson was over. Children were spilling out into the dusty yard, their shouts and laughter a fragile sound against the immense, thirsty silence of the land. Evelyn Hart stood by the water pump, a tin dipper in her hand. She worked the handle, and after a moment's struggle, a small splash of water emerged. She didn't drink. She poured the precious cupful over her hands, washing away the chalk dust of the day, the water vanishing into the parched earth the moment it touched. The gesture was small, practical, and utterly devastating. The fight wasn't about land or money. It was about every single, finite drop of water. And it had already begun. The days in Silver Butte settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the dust. Life was a collection of small, repeating motions. The squeak of the pump handle at the town well, the murmur of gossip at the general store where sacks of flour and bolts of cotton stood like silent witnesses, the bright, disciplined voices of children reciting their letters from the schoolhouse. In the evenings, a particular chemical scent, sharp and clean, would sometimes drift from the small room Evelyn Hart had rented, the smell of photographs being brought to life. It was a foreign scent in a town that smelled mostly of horse, hot metal, and dry earth. Caleb Mercer found reasons to be in town more often. He told himself it was to check on feed prices or to talk weather with the other ranchers, conversations that always ended on a grim note, but his path always seemed to lead him past the schoolhouse. One morning before dawn, he noticed the schoolyard gate hanging crookedly on a single hinge. He didn't knock on her door. He went to his wagon, retrieved his tools, and with quiet, efficient movements, rehung the gate. The rasp of the file on the metal hinged the only sound in the gray light. Another day, walking past during recess, he heard a sharp crack followed by a child's cry. A girl had put her foot through a rotten plank on the porch. The next morning, before the children arrived, a new, solid plank of fresh-sawn pine was neatly nailed in its place. He never mentioned the repairs. They were quiet acts, fences mended around a space that was hers, a way of offering protection without intrusion. He respected her solitude as much as he admired her strength. In the dim light of her rented room, Evelyn worked. She had turned a small pantry into a dark room, its single window covered with thick blankets, under the glow of a red lantern. She watched the image emerge in the tray of developer. It was the photograph she had taken at Coyote Pass, blurry from the haste and the poor light. But as the shapes resolved from the chemical mist, she saw it. On the side of the heavy crate, faint but unmistakable, was a painted letter C, the tail of which looped into the distinct ampersand of the Crow and Company logo. She felt a cold certainty wash over her. Why would common thieves be using a shipping crate belonging to Silas Crow to steal a box of school books? She dried the plate carefully, and later, in the privacy of her journal, she sketched the logo and wrote the question beside it, a single, sharp hook in a sea of unknowns. The whispers started in the saloon. Silas Crow made sure of it, buying a round of whiskey and letting a comment slip to Tully Pike, just loud enough for the bartender to hear. A shame about that business with the teacher. You hear she's Jasper Vale's sister. The rumor spread from there, moving through town like a tumbleweed, gathering dust and momentum. Sheriff Nora Bell stopped by the schoolhouse one afternoon. She leaned against the doorframe, her hat tipped back, her expression unreadable. Heard some talk. Miss Hart. I imagine you hear a lot of talk, Sheriff. I do, Nora agreed. Most of it's harmless static, but this has a name attached to it. A wanted name. She met Evelyn's gaze. I'm not asking you to confirm or deny. I'm advising you that in a town this dry, a rumor can catch fire faster than a barn full of hay. Be careful who you trust. The land itself seemed to confirm the sheriff's warning. The line of Willow Creek was now a cracked, sun-baked scar. A rancher lost 2 calves, their coats patchy and their bodies too weak to stand. The wind was a constant, abrasive presence, carrying a fine grit that worked its way into everything, into the food, the water, the lungs, and the crows, once scattered, now gathered in large, silent flocks on the branches of the dead cottonwoods, their black eyes watching, waiting. Yet, in the face of this slow decay, the town's heart beat stubbornly on. Reverend Amos Hale, a man whose faith was as practical as a well-made harness, organized a work party. The Lord helps those who help each other, he declared from the pulpit. We'll build a communal shelter for the weakest livestock from any ranch that needs it. We'll share what little fodder we have. The men worked together, their hammers echoing the sound from old Ben's smithy. The women brought food and water, their quiet cooperation a testament to a strength Silas Crow could never understand. Evelyn did her part. She set up her camera in the town square on Saturday and offered to take family portraits for a small fee, all proceeds. She announced on a neatly lettered sign, "Will go to the fund for a new community well." Families came, dressed in their Sunday best, standing stiffly before her lens. She coaxed smiles from children and eased the worried lines on the faces of their parents, capturing small moments of dignity and hope amid the hardship. For Caleb, the situation was a ghost from his past. He remembered a desert ambush years ago, scouting for the army. He'd seen his commanding officer make a terrible decision, sacrificing a small band of friendly scouts to save his own reputation. Caleb had known it was wrong. He had seen the injustice as it unfolded, but he had held his tongue. He was a junior scout, and he had followed orders. The silence a sour taste in his mouth that had never truly gone away. Now, he saw it happening again, in slow motion. Silas Crow, a man in a position of power, was preparing to sacrifice a community for his own gain. The question haunted Caleb's quiet moments. Watching his horses by the dying creek, would he remain silent again? Or would he finally find his voice? Evelyn felt a similar pull, a conflict that churned beneath her calm exterior. The secret of her name and her brother was a heavy cloak. Every day was a performance. Every conversation a careful navigation. The easiest thing, the safest thing, would be to pack her wagon and disappear, to move on to the next town, the next temporary life. But then she would look at the faces of her students, their trust so absolute. She would see the new plank on the porch and the sturdy gate that now swung true on its hinges. And she would remember the look in Caleb Mercer's eyes, a steady, unwavering gaze that didn't pry but simply saw her. For the first time in years, she felt the dangerous, unfamiliar desire to stay. One afternoon, Caleb was helping one of the schoolboys, a youngster named Thomas, whittle a piece of wood. The boy's younger sister, a small, fiercely observant girl named Sarah, stood watching them. She was the same girl Evelyn had helped find her voice in the classroom. Sarah looked from Caleb's focused expression to the schoolhouse, where Evelyn was cleaning the windows. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice clear as a bell, "do you look at every lady that way?" Caleb's hand stilled. A slow, deep red crept up from his collar. He looked at the girl, whose expression was one of pure, innocent curiosity. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Then, a low chuckle rumbled in his chest, a rare and genuine sound. He shook his head, a smile touching his lips. "Just the ones who make me forget what I was about to say." The approach of the waterboard hearing cast a long shadow. Word got around that Silas Crow had hired an expert engineer from back east to present a report on the dam's necessity. No one had ever seen the man, but his supposed credentials were a subject of much discussion and intimidation. That evening, Caleb sought out Sheriff Nora. He found her in her office, cleaning her rifle under the light of an oil lamp. "Something's not right about this," Caleb said, skipping any preamble. "Crow's not a man who leaves things to chance. This expert is a fraud." Nora didn't look up from her work. "My gut tells me the same thing, but my gut isn't admissible evidence. Caleb." "Then we need to find some—" He leaned forward, his hands on her desk. "He's planning something more than just stealing water. The dam, the fake robbery, the rumors, it's all connected." An hour later, under the cover of a moonless sky, they rode out toward the dam. They left their horses tethered in a ravine and approached the construction site on foot. The half-finished structure loomed against the stars, a dark, ugly wound on the landscape. The only sound was the wind whistling through the timber scaffolding. They moved carefully, staying in the shadows. Caleb, with his scout's training, led the way. He pointed to a section of the dam near the base, where the rock and earth had been freshly disturbed. They crept closer. There, wedged deep into the foundation, were several dozen wooden stakes. Wrapped around each stake was a familiar, greasy paper cylinder with a fuse. Dynamite. Nora knelt, touching one of the charges gently. "This isn't for construction," she whispered, her voice grim. "The placement is all wrong. This is for demolition." Caleb looked from the explosives to the dry ancient creek bed that old Ben had told him about, which ran parallel to the new construction. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. "He's going to blow the old channel," he said, his voice tight with fury. "He'll blast it, collapse it, bury the deep spring forever." "And when the dam breaks from the blast," Nora added, her eyes dark, "he'll blame it on saboteurs, like Jasper Vale, and the water, what's left of it, will have only one way to go, straight into his private reservoir." It was a plan of breathtaking cruelty, a permanent theft disguised as a tragic accident. They now had their evidence, but it was a dangerous and explosive secret to keep. Despite the heavy secret of the dynamite lying dormant at the dam, the harvest fair bloomed in the center of Silver Butte like a stubborn desert flower. Bonfires pushed back the evening chill, their flickering light dancing on the faces of farmers and ranchers who had, for one night, set aside their worries about the water. The air was thick with the scent of roasted corn and spiced pumpkin, and the lively, sawing rhythm of a fiddle sawed through the dry air, calling even the most tired feet to dance. Evelyn Hart wore a simple dress of dark blue cotton, its clean lines a contrast to the frills and bustles on some of the town's more established ladies. She moved through the fair with her camera, capturing the life of the town in silver and glass. She photographed the children's three-legged race, the proud display of oversized vegetables, and old Ben's anvil shooting contest, where the blacksmith launched a chunk of iron 100 feet in the air with a charge of black powder, to the delight of the crowd. Caleb Mercer watched her from a distance. He stood near the edge of the firelight, a tall, quiet shape against the darkness of the prairie. He was acutely aware of the whispers that still followed her, the lingering poison of Silas Crow's rumor. To approach her too directly, to claim her attention in front of the entire town, would be to paint a fresh target on her back. So he kept his distance, a silent guardian she didn't know she had, his gaze following her as she navigated the festival with a grace and composure that seemed unshakable. He saw Hattie Hale approach Evelyn, her round face wreathed in a genuine smile. Hattie pressed a slice of her famous pumpkin pie into Evelyn's hand and then, with a conspiratorial glance toward Caleb, said something that made Evelyn look over at him. For a moment, their eyes met across the crackling fire. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. A small smile touched Evelyn's lips before she looked away. The fiddler struck up a reel, and the ground in front of the makeshift stage filled with stomping boots and swirling skirts. Caleb felt a nudge at his elbow. It was Reverend Hale. "A man can't hold up a wall all night. Son," the Reverend said, his eyes twinkling. "Go on. The teacher looks like she could use a partner who doesn't have two left feet." Before Caleb could protest, he found himself walking toward her, the space between them, which he had so carefully maintained, closed with every step. He stopped before her, feeling as awkward as a boy of 15. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice a little rough, "would you do me the honor?" She looked down at the half-eaten pie in her hand, then back at him. "Only if you promise not to make me drop my dessert, Mr. Mercer." He took the plate from her and set it on a nearby barrel. When he turned back, she was waiting. He took her hand, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. Her hand was cool and steady in his. He led her into the throng of dancers, and for a few minutes, there was only the music and the movement. They were not graceful, but they moved together with an easy, unpracticed rhythm. The worries of the town, the threat of the dam, the shadow of her brother's name, it all receded to the edge of the firelight, leaving them in a small circle of warmth and music. As the fiddle tune slowed to a waltz, he kept her hand in his. He didn't pull her closer, but he didn't let her go. He just looked at her, at the way the firelight caught the stray strands of her hair and the serious, intelligent light in her eyes. A playful smile touched her lips. "Do you always look at every girl that way?" she asked, her voice a low murmur beneath the music. The question caught him off guard. A genuine, small laugh escaped him. He looked away for a second, then met her gaze again, his own eyes holding a sincerity that was as raw and real as the landscape around them. "Only the ones who make me forget what I was about to say." The honesty in his voice was a tangible thing, a moment of unguarded truth that made her breath catch. The music, the crowd, the entire world seemed to hold still. The moment was broken by a rough voice. "Well, look here, the Vale family schoolteacher, dancing with our town hero?" Tully Pike stood just outside the circle of dancers, a sneer twisting his lips. A few of his friends from Crow's work crew snickered behind him. The music faltered as people turned to stare. The warmth of the moment evaporated, replaced by a sudden, ugly chill. Caleb didn't release Evelyn's hand. He turned slowly, his body positioning itself squarely between her and Pike. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clench his fists. He simply stood there, a solid, immovable object. "Here," Caleb said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that cut through the silence. "We call her Miss Hart." Pike's eyes narrowed, but he saw something in Caleb's calm, steady gaze that made him hesitate. It was the look of a man who had seen real violence and had no taste for the cheap imitation Pike was offering, muttering under his breath. Tully Pike turned and disappeared back into the shadows, his cronies trailing behind him. The fiddler, after a moment's hesitation, struck up a new tune, but the spell was broken. Later, as the fare began to thin, Evelyn found a purpose for her camera beyond capturing happy memories. She saw a light burning in the large tent that served as Silas Crow's temporary headquarters. The flap was open, and two of his men were bent over a table, their heads close together. Spread out before them was a large, hand-drawn map. Evelyn's instincts sharpened, pretending to adjust her tripod to get a shot of the moon rising over the butte. She angled her camera. From this distance, she couldn't make out the details, but she knew the importance of evidence. With a silent click, she captured the image of the men in their map, another piece of a puzzle she couldn't yet see in its entirety. Not far away, Caleb was demonstrating a different kind of skill. A group of boys were roughhousing, practicing with their lariats by roping a fence post, pretending it was a runaway steer. Caleb walked over. "You're pulling too hard," he told them. "You'll choke a real animal that way." He took one of the ropes. A rope can be a tool to help, not just to catch. With nimble fingers, he retied the knot, creating a loop that would hold but not tighten under pressure. It's called a rescue knot. You use it to pull a calf out of a mud hole or a friend out of a tight spot. He showed them how to throw it, the loop landing perfectly over the post. Evelyn watched from the shadows, seeing the quiet decency of the man, the way he turned a tool of capture into one of salvation. As the evening wore on, the wind began to shift. The playful gusts that had earlier sent napkins flying from picnic blankets grew colder, more insistent. Dark clouds, thick and heavy, began to mass on the western horizon, blotting out the stars. A low moaning sound started in the distance, the sound of wind rushing over empty plains. The canvas flags strung between the tents began to whip and snap, some tearing from their ropes with a sharp, cracking sound. The happy sounds of the fair were slowly being replaced by the ominous creak and groan of a world bracing for a storm. A dust storm was coming. People began to pack their belongings, calling to their children and casting worried glances at the sky. Hattie Hale found Evelyn as she was carefully packing away her photographic plates. Hattie pressed a folded piece of cloth into Evelyn's hands. It was a simple kitchen towel, old and soft from years of use, embroidered with a small, faded blue flower. "Every home needs a good towel," Hattie said simply. Her eyes were kind. "You're doing good work with our children. Evelyn, we'd be proud if you made your home here." It was more than a gift. It was an invitation. It was a thread of belonging offered from one woman to another, a quiet statement that this town could be her family, if she chose it. Caleb looked at the approaching storm and then at Evelyn, standing there with the towel in her hands. He realized with a startling clarity that he didn't just want to protect her. He wanted a future that included her. He wanted to see her teaching the children, to hear her quiet, intelligent voice in the evenings, to build a life with her here, in this hard, beautiful land. He knew she had secrets, a past that she kept carefully guarded behind those clear, steady eyes. He respected that. He would not ask, not yet. He would wait until she felt safe enough to tell him herself. A boy ran up to the sheriff, breathless, handing her a slip of paper. Nora Bell read it, her face hardening. She strode quickly over to where Caleb was helping the Hales secure their tent. "Telegraph from the next county," she said, her voice low and urgent. "There's a special train coming through tonight. It's carrying the railroad payroll." Caleb understood immediately. "Crow." "He'll use it as an excuse," Nora confirmed, her jaw tight. "He'll claim he needs to protect the line from thieves like Jasper Vale. He'll post armed guards all over these hills. No one will be able to get within a mile of that dam. Their window to expose the dynamite, to stop him before he blew the old creek bed, was closing. The storm, the payroll, the hearing it was all coming to a head. The first gust of the dust storm hit, a wall of grit and wind that sent people running for shelter. The fair was over. Caleb looked through the swirling red haze toward the distant, dark shape of the dam. The time for silence was past. The time for quiet, anonymous actions was over. He would stand up at that waterboard hearing. He would speak the truth, whatever the cost. Across the now empty town square, Evelyn hurried toward her room, shielding her face from the stinging dust. In her mind, she was already preparing. She would develop the plate with the map. She would have her evidence ready. The blurry image of the Crow and Company crate, the new photograph of the canal map, and her own testimony. They were fragile weapons against a powerful man, but they were the weapons of truth. The storm was here, and both she and Caleb, alone but united in purpose, were preparing to walk into its heart. The town hall was packed, shoulder to shoulder, the air already stale and tasting of the red dust that seeped in through the window frames. The wind had been rising all morning, a low, mournful sound that seemed a fitting prelude to the day's business. Farmers with worried lines etched around their eyes, ranchers whose hands were clenched into fists, shopkeepers, and wives, they were all there, a community holding its collective breath. At the front of the room, the 3 members of the Silver Butte Water Board sat behind a long table, looking small and uncomfortable in their Sunday suits. Silas Crow stood before them, a picture of calm confidence. He was not dressed like a man who worked the land. His suit was dark, well-tailored, his boots polished to a high shine. He spoke in a smooth, reasonable tone, his voice carrying easily to the back of the room. He spoke of the unprecedented drought, of hardship, of the future. His dam, he explained, was not a private enterprise, but an act of civic charity, a modern solution to an ancient problem. It was a drought relief project that would secure Silver Butte's prosperity for generations. He then introduced his expert, a pale, nervous man from Chicago named Mr. Abernathy, who clutched a sheaf of papers. Abernathy began to read in a monotonous drone, his voice filled with numbers and technical terms, acre-feet, flow rates, geological substrata. It was a language designed to intimidate and confuse, a blizzard of facts that buried the simple truth. The crowd grew restless, their initial suspicion giving way to a weary confusion. How could they argue with charts and figures they didn't understand? When he finished, a heavy silence filled the room. The chairman of the board cleared his throat. "Does anyone wish to speak in response?" For a moment, no one moved. Then, from the side of the room, Evelyn Hart stood up. "I do," she said. Her voice, though not loud, was clear and cut through the dusty air. A murmur went through the crowd. She walked to the front, carrying a small, portable easel and a portfolio. She did not look at Silas Crow. She addressed the board and the town. "I am not an engineer," she began, setting up the easel. "I cannot speak about flow rates, but I can show you what I have seen." She placed her first photograph on the easel. It was the image from Coyote Pass, blurry but distinct. She pointed to the crate. "This is the box the 2 men who accosted me were trying to take. As you can see, it bears the mark of the Crow and Company." She paused, letting the implication settle. "I have to ask, why would men attempting a robbery be using equipment belonging to the very company whose interests they were supposedly threatening?" Silas Crow shifted in his seat, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. A stolen crate? No doubt, the work of Jasper Vale's associates, I would imagine. Evelyn ignored him. She replaced the first photograph with a second. It was the image she had taken from the edge of the harvest fair, a clear shot of the map in Crow's tent. "And this," she said, her voice even, "is a map I saw Mr. Crow's men studying. It does not show a reservoir to supplement Willow Creek. It shows a new, man-made channel, diverting water away from all of your lands and toward a single, private destination." The murmurs in the room grew louder. People were turning to look at Crow, their faces hardening with suspicion. "And finally," Evelyn said, her voice dropping slightly, "there is the matter of the dam itself." She placed a third photograph on the easel. It was a stark, close-up image, taken in the harsh light of dawn. It showed the wooden stakes and the greasy, paper-wrapped cylinders of dynamite wedged into the dam's foundation. These were discovered 2 nights ago, placed not to build, but to destroy. They are positioned to collapse the old, deep channel of the creek, to bury the spring that has fed this valley for 1,000 years. The room erupted. Shouts of, "Is this true?" and "Thief" filled the air. The chairman hammered his gavel, but the noise was too great. Through it all, Silas Crow did not move. He waited, a faint, predatory smile on his lips. He let the anger crest, Let the town's fury focus entirely on him. Then, when the noise began to subside, he slowly rose to his feet and held up a hand. The room, expecting a denial, fell silent. "Evidence," Crow said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "The young lady speaks of evidence. It is an important word. It requires that we look at the source. Who is this woman who makes such terrible accusations?" He stepped forward, pulling a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket. "She calls herself Evelyn Hart, a respectable name, but is it her name?" He let the question hang in the air. "I have gone to some trouble, and some expense, to learn the truth. This woman," he declared, his voice rising, "is not Evelyn Hart. Her name is Evelyn Vale." A collective gasp went through the room. The name hung in the air, thick and poisonous. "And as for who she is," Crow continued, his eyes locking onto Evelyn's, "perhaps this will make it clear." He produced a folded newspaper, the Cheyenne Daily Leader. He unfolded it and held it up for all to see. It was a grainy photograph of a man, his face bruised, a dark stain spreading across the front of his shirt. It was her brother, Jasper. "The sister of a wanted criminal," Crow announced, his voice booming in the silent room. "A woman who has lied to you from the moment she arrived. She comes into our town under a false name. And you are going to believe her photographs over the word of a man who is trying to save you." The reversal was instant and absolute. The tide of anger that had been directed at Crow now turned, with the force of a flash flood, upon Evelyn. The looks of suspicion became glares of betrayal. The whispers turned to angry shouts. "She lied to us," a woman cried out from the back. "Get her out of here," another man yelled. The mother of the little girl Evelyn had helped Red stood up, her face pale with anger. "We cannot have the sister of a killer teaching our children." The children in the room, brought to witness the workings of civic life, began to cry, confused and frightened by the raw anger of their parents. Evelyn stood frozen, the easel with her damning evidence forgotten. She was alone, the target of a town's fear and rage. Then, a figure moved. Caleb Mercer, who had been standing silently against the back wall, began to walk forward. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace, the crowd parting before him as if he were a boulder rolling through a shallow stream. He didn't stop until he was standing beside her. He didn't look at her, but his presence was a shield. He faced the town, his gaze sweeping over their angry faces. "I believe the evidence in those photographs," he said. His voice was not loud, but it had the solid, unyielding quality of bedrock. It cut through the noise. "I don't believe in rumors." He held the gaze of the angriest men in the room, one by one, until they looked away. Then he looked directly at Silas Crow. Before the chaos could ignite again, Sheriff Nora Bell stepped into the space between the stage and the crowd. "That's enough," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that no one dared to challenge. She placed herself in front of Evelyn and Caleb. "This hearing is over. Miss Vale, or Hart, or whatever her name is a material witness in an active investigation. As such, she is under the protection of my office." She looked out at the crowd. "This will be settled by the law, not by a mob." The meeting dissolved into a confused and angry exodus. As people began to push their way out of the hall, the dust storm, which had been threatening all day, finally broke. A howling gust of wind slammed against the building, rattling the windows in their frames. The sky outside turned a bruised, menacing shade of red, and the world dissolved into a swirling vortex of dust and debris. In the confusion of the emptying hall, Caleb moved toward Crow, who was putting on his hat near the door. "Crow," Caleb said, his voice low. Crow turned, his smile smug. "Mercer, come to your senses." "Stay away from her," Caleb said. It was not a request. "And stay away from that creek. If anything happens to either of them, you'll have to come through me." Crow laughed, a short, ugly sound. A threat from a washed-up scout. "You can't stop progress. Mercer, He turned and stepped out into the storm, disappearing into the red haze. Evelyn watched them, her heart a tight, aching knot in her chest. She wanted to run to Caleb, to tell him everything, to explain about Jasper, about the frame-up, about the fear she had lived with for so long. But she saw the faces of the townspeople as they passed her, their eyes filled with hatred and suspicion. To tell Caleb the full truth now would be to tie him to her, to Jasper, to pull him down into the same danger that was swirling around her. She held her silence, a strategic and painful choice. The truth would have to wait. Miles away, at the construction site of the dam, the storm was a living thing, a furious entity that tore at the timber scaffolding and ripped sheets of canvas from their moorings. A lone figure, huddled against the wind, knelt beside a small wooden shed where the extra explosives were stored. With a gloved hand, the figure pulled out a short length of fuse. Shielding it from the wind, the figure struck a match. The flame flared, bright against the red gloom. The figure touched the flame to the end of the fuse. It sparked, sputtered, and for one terrifying second, it caught, a tiny, burning star in the heart of the storm. Then a furious gust of wind snuffed it out. The figure cursed and tried again. The explosion was not a boom, but a sharp, violent crack that tore through the howling of the dust storm. It was followed a second later by a hungry, orange glare that lit the red haze from within. The small explosives shed at the foot of the dam had gone up. For a moment, the entire town of Silver Butte stood frozen, the shock of the blast a physical blow. Then, as a column of greasy black smoke climbed into the swirling dust, the spell broke and the town ran toward the disaster. Caleb and Nora were already moving. They had seen the first flicker of fire through the gloom and were halfway to the dam when the shed blew. They were joined almost immediately by Maya Running Deer, who seemed to appear out of the storm itself, a leather satchel of medical supplies already slung over her shoulder. The scene at the dam was chaos. The fire from the shed had leaped to a nearby stack of timber, and the heat was intense, a physical wall that pushed back against the wind. Men shouted, their voices thin against the roar of the fire and the storm. A bucket brigade was already forming, a desperate, futile line against the inferno. "Keep everyone back from the main structure," Nora yelled, her voice a commander's bellow. "There could be more charges." Caleb's eyes scanned the scene, his scout's mind assessing, prioritizing. The pump wagon, he shouted, pointing toward the town's hand-pumped fire engine, which a group of men were struggling to pull through the thick dust. "We need to get water on those timbers before they fall onto the dam itself." Evelyn was already there. She had run with the first wave of people, her personal fears forgotten in the face of the town's immediate crisis. She grabbed one of the long pump handles alongside 3 other women, and they began to work, their bodies moving in a grueling, punishing rhythm. Up and down, the pump wheezing and groaning as it sucked a thin stream of water from the town's nearly empty emergency cistern. A weak jet of water sprayed from the hose, turning to steam almost instantly as it hit the fire. A woman screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through the noise. "My boy Daniel is in there." She was pointing at the large, smoky warehouse next to the fire, where Crow stored his tools and equipment. He was playing inside. Before Nora could stop him, Caleb was gone. A damp bandana pulled up over his nose and mouth. He disappeared into the thick smoke billowing from the warehouse doorway. Inside, it was a blind man's world. Smoke burned his eyes and lungs. Heat radiated from the wall adjoining the fire. He shouted the boy's name, his voice muffled and raw. He heard a faint, whimpering cough from a back corner, behind a stack of barrels. He found the boy, Daniel, huddled on the floor, terrified and disoriented. Caleb scooped him up in his arms. "Hold on tight," he said, his voice a low rumble of reassurance. "We're going for a walk." As he turned to go back, a section of the burning timber pile outside collapsed with a roar, sending a shower of embers onto the warehouse roof. The dry shingles caught instantly. The fire was no longer next to them. It was above them. Outside, Evelyn felt the heat on her back intensify. A tongue of flame licked out from the warehouse roof. She pumped harder, her arms screaming in protest, her lungs heaving. She did not stop. She did not look away. She just pumped, her focus narrowed to the single, desperate task. Caleb emerged from the smoke, a ghostly figure carrying the small, coughing child. He placed the boy into his mother's arms and turned back toward the fire. Just as a corner of the explosives shed, which had been burning with a strange, chemical intensity, blew apart in a second, smaller explosion. This one was different. It sent a shock wave through the ground and hurled chunks of burning wood against the face of the dam. A deep, groaning sound came from the structure, and a jagged, hair-lined crack appeared near the base, a dark fissure in the raw earth and rock. By the time the dust storm began to blow itself out near midnight, the fire was contained. The warehouse was a smoldering ruin. The timber pile was a bed of glowing coals, and the dam was scarred but holding. Silas Crow, who had appeared late in the proceedings to direct the fight from a safe distance, was already spinning his narrative. It was sabotage, he declared to anyone who would listen, his face a mask of grim concern. The work of the Veil Gang. No doubt. An attempt to destroy our town's salvation. They will not succeed. In the chaotic aftermath, the town hall was turned into a makeshift infirmary. Maya moved among the injured with a calm efficiency, treating burns and setting a broken arm. Evelyn found herself in a quiet corner of Old Ben's smithy, which had been spared the worst of the smoke. Her left forearm was scraped and burned, a long, angry red mark from a flying ember. She had barely noticed it in the heat of the moment, but now it throbbed with a fiery pain. The door creaked open, and Caleb stepped inside, his face smudged with soot, his eyes red-rimmed and weary. He carried a small wooden box. "Maya's busy," he said, his voice quiet. "Let me see." She held out her arm. He knelt in front of her, opening the box. He cleaned the wound with a cloth soaked in carbolic acid, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man with such calloused hands. She flinched at the sting, and his fingers tightened instinctively on her wrist for a moment before he let go. In the dim light from the forge's dying embers, she could see the slight tremble in his hands, or perhaps it was her own. He worked in silence, concentrating on wrapping a clean linen bandage around her arm. The world outside, with its shouting and its fear, felt 1,000 miles away. Here, in the dark, warm space, there was only the smell of smoke and iron, and the careful touch of his hands on her skin. It was more intimate than any conversation, a silent acknowledgement of the crucible they had just passed through together. When he was done, she flexing her fingers, "Thank you." He nodded, his eyes meeting hers in the gloom. The question he had been holding back since the hearing was there, unspoken but clear. She took a breath. "You deserve to know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Some of it." She told him about Jasper, not about the frame-up, not about the payroll, but about a different plan. He found out that Crow was using the railroad to ship goods that were not on the official manifests, illegal goods, smuggled past federal inspectors. He believed if he could get proof, he could trade it to the authorities for a pardon on some earlier trouble he was in. She looked down at her bandaged arm. "He wrote to me because of my camera. He asked me to come here, to find a way to photograph Crow's shipping ledgers. It was supposed to be his way out, his way to a clean slate." She looked up, her eyes pleading for him to believe. "Before I could even try. They accused him of the payroll robbery. They set a trap for him, and he walked right into it." While she spoke, Sheriff Nora Bell walked into the smithy. She was holding a tattered, half-burned piece of a ledger book. "Found this in the warehouse wreckage," she said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "Looks like the fire didn't get everything." Caleb took the scorched pages. Most of it was unreadable, but a few columns of numbers and shipping destinations were still visible. As he turned it over, a small clump of dried mud fell from the singed binding onto the anvil. Maya, who had followed Nora in, bent down and picked up the small piece of earth. She crumbled it between her fingers, sniffing it. "This is not from around here," she said. Her eyes, dark and knowing, met Caleb's. "This mud is from Beartooth Wash. It has a sour smell. The ground there is full of sulfur from the hot springs. A wash, a remote, inaccessible place. The perfect place to hide stolen goods." The pieces clicked into place with a cold, hard certainty. Caleb looked at Evelyn. "Beartooth Wash," he said. "We need to go there." "I will go," she corrected him softly but firmly. "This is my brother's fight. I have the photographs. I know what to look for." "You won't go alone," he stated. He then held up a hand to stop her protest. "But you will lead. You know the clues. I'll just be there to watch your back." The respect in his voice, the easy way he offered his strength without trying to claim her authority, was a balm on her raw nerves. A small, weary smile touched her lips. "I hope your aim is better than your bandaging skills," she teased gently. He looked down at the neat, white bandage on her arm as if seeing it for the first time. "What's wrong with it?" he asked, a hint of defensive pride in his voice. "That's a fine piece of work." The small moment of humor was a release, a bubble of air in the crushing pressure of the night. He saw her then, not as the mysterious schoolteacher or the sister of a wanted man, but as a woman of incredible courage and intelligence. His desire to protect her had shifted, deepened. It wasn't just about shielding her from harm anymore. It was about believing in her, in the way her mind worked, in the truth she was so determined to uncover. He trusted her judgment as much as he trusted his own. "We'll leave at dawn," he said. It was a shared decision, an unspoken pact. Later that night, the last of the embers had been doused. The town was quiet, an exhausted silence that was deeper than sleep. Evelyn sat on the porch of her rented room, the borrowed kitchen towel from Hattie Hale folded in her lap. The dust had settled, and the sky was a vast, clear canvas of stars. She thought of her brother, of the danger that lay ahead at Beartooth Wash, of the man who had stood by her when the entire town had turned against her. She thought of running, of how easy it would be to disappear into the night and leave this all behind, but she knew she wouldn't. Something had changed. She looked up at the cold, distant stars and whispered into the darkness, a promise made only to herself. "Don't let me run away again." The land beyond Silver Butte was a hard, unforgiving country. They rode out at first light into a world bleached of color, a valley of pale limestone and gray sagebrush. The sun climbed a cloudless sky, and the heat pressed down, a physical weight that shimmered above the rocks. The wind was a constant, abrasive whisper, carrying nothing but dust and the dry scent of sun-baked earth. They rode in silence for the most part, conserving their energy. Their world shrunk to the plodding rhythm of their horses' hooves and the creak of saddle leather. Caleb set a steady pace, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain, a habit from his scouting days that had never left him. He noticed how Evelyn, despite her slender frame, sat her horse with an easy, resilient posture, her body moving with the animal, not against it. She was tougher than anyone in town gave her credit for. He pulled his canteen from his saddle and passed it to her without a word. She took it, drank sparingly, and passed it back. He watched as she adjusted the bandana covering the lower half of her face, her eyes clear and focused above the cloth, never stopping their own careful survey of the land. It was a partnership of few words, built on a shared, unspoken understanding of the stakes. They were following the faint trace of a dry wash when Caleb pulled his horse to a halt. He held up a hand, listening. Above the sound of the wind, another sound drifted from a narrow side canyon, a thin, distressed bleating. Evelyn heard it too, and her eyes met his. They turned their horses and nudged them into the canyon, the rock walls rising steeply on either side. In a low, muddy basin where a spring had once flowed, 3 calves were hopelessly mired. They had wandered in seeking water and were now trapped in the thick, clinging mud, their small bodies exhausted from their struggle. They were sunk to their bellies, their cries growing weaker. "They won't last another hour in this sun," Caleb said. Dismounting, he uncoiled the rope from his saddle, his hands moving with a familiar, practiced efficiency. Evelyn watched him. "That knot," she said, her voice quiet. "The one you showed the children." He looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes that she had remembered. "A rescue knot," he confirmed. He fashioned the loop, its design simple but ingenious. Made to hold without tightening, it will have to be a slow pull. The horses will do the work. They worked as a team, their movements synchronized and efficient. Caleb waded into the edge of the mud, his boots sinking as he threw the loop over the first calf, settling it high on its chest, just behind its front legs. He gave the rope to Evelyn, who had wrapped the other end around her saddle horn. "Easy now," he said. "Just a steady walk." She backed her horse slowly, the rope going taut. The calf, too weak to fight, was drawn slowly from the mud's grip with a sound like a giant cork being pulled from a bottle. They repeated the process twice more, their face grim with concentration, the sun beating down on their backs. When the last calf was free, it wobbled on unsteady legs before joining its siblings, who were already nudging at their mother. A frantic cow watching from the canyon rim. Caleb and Evelyn stood for a moment, breathing heavily, covered in mud and sweat. They had not spoken more than a dozen words, but they had worked together as if they had been doing it their entire lives. The simple act of saving a life, any life, felt like a small, necessary victory in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile. They found the cave 2 hours later. It was exactly as Maya's description of the terrain had suggested. A narrow opening concealed behind a rockfall of sulfur-stained limestone, the sour smell of the earth sharp in the air. Inside, the air was cool and still. It took a moment for their eyes to adjust to the gloom. The cave was larger than it looked from the outside, and it was filled with wooden crates and barrels, stacked high against the rock walls. Caleb lit a lantern, and in its yellow glow, they saw the familiar stenciled logo, Crow and Company, on every container. This was his shadow warehouse, his hidden larder of smuggled goods. Evelyn unpacked her camera, while Caleb stood guard at the entrance. She worked with a focused, almost reverent intensity. The quiet, mechanical click of the shutter echoed in the silent cave. She photographed the stacks of crates, the trail of muddy footprints leading in and out, and then, using a small pry bar from Caleb's saddlebag, she opened one of the crates. It was filled with rifles, their metal parts gleaming with grease. She found the manifest tucked inside, a list of serial numbers. She pulled out the charred scrap of ledger Nora had found and flattened it on a rock. Even in the dim light, they could see it. The numbers matched. As she worked, a profound shift was taking place inside her. The heavy burden of her brother's name, the shame and fear that had been her constant companions, began to feel different. It was no longer a personal disgrace, but a great and terrible injustice. Looking at the cold, hard proof of Crow's criminality, she finally began to accept that she might never know what truly happened to Jasper. He might be dead in some unmarked grave or wasting away in a federal prison, but standing here, in this cave, she was no longer just his sister. She was a witness. The truth was her burden now, and her weapon. A scuff of a boot on loose rock outside the cave shattered the silence. Caleb was instantly alert. His hand dropping to the pistol on his hip, he put a finger to his lips and flattened himself against the rock wall beside the entrance. Evelyn froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Tully Pike stepped into the cave's entrance, blinking in the sudden gloom. He had a rifle held loosely in one hand. His eyes widened in surprise as he saw Evelyn, and he began to raise the weapon. He never had the chance. A single shot, deafening in the enclosed space, ripped through the air. Tully's rifle flew from his hands, clattering against the rocks. He yelped, clutching a hand that was now bleeding. Before he could even think to draw his sidearm, Caleb was on him, knocking him to the ground and pressing the warm barrel of his pistol against Tully's neck. "Don't move," Caleb said, his voice a low, cold whisper. They tied him securely, his blustering threats and curses slowly giving way to a sullen, fearful silence. "Why are you here?" Tully Caleb asked, his voice calm, which made it all the more menacing. "Crow sent me," Tully mumbled, avoiding his eyes, "to check on things." "He's getting nervous," Evelyn stated, her voice steady despite the adrenaline singing in her veins. "Our pictures at the hearing made him nervous." Tully sneered. "You think your pictures matter? You're too late. You're all too late." He spat on the cave floor. "You can't stop what's coming. By the light of the next full moon, that dam is going to blow." Evelyn and Caleb exchanged a look of cold, dawning horror. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. "He's going to do it himself," Evelyn whispered, the full, monstrous scope of the plan becoming clear. "He'll blow the dam, and the flood will destroy any evidence of the old creek bed. He'll blame it on my brother, on saboteurs. And all those ranches downstream," Caleb added, his voice grim. "The families, the livestock, they'll all be washed away." They rode back with a grim urgency, their prisoner tied to his own horse and led between them. They met Nora and Maya at a ridge overlooking the valley. The lights of Silver Butte, a faint twinkle in the distance, in the cold starlight. They laid out the story, the photographs, the matching numbers, and Tully Pike's damning words. The four of them stood together, a small council of war against a gathering darkness. "I'll take Pike back to town," Nora said, her voice hard as iron. "I'll lock him in a cell and wire the territorial marshal. We'll have a legal confession and the physical evidence from this cave." "The families in the low valley need to be warned," Maya said, her gaze already turning toward the downstream ranches. "I will ride now. I can get them moving to higher ground before morning." That left the dam. Caleb and Evelyn knew what they had to do. They had to get back there, to try to stop the blast, to face Crow. As Nora and Maya prepared to leave, Caleb turned to Evelyn. The wind was picking up, cold and sharp, carrying the first hints of a changing weather pattern. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a thin silver chain. On it was a small, simple pendant, a smooth, worn piece of silver that caught the faint starlight. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice low and rough. He unfastened the clasp and, without asking permission, reached around her neck. His fingers brushed against her skin as he fastened the chain. The metal was cool against her throat. He stepped back, his eyes holding hers. "So you know you have a place to belong when you're scared," he said. It was not a declaration of love, but something deeper, quieter, a promise of sanctuary in a world that offered none. She raised a hand and touched the pendant, its worn surface a small, solid anchor in the terrifying uncertainty of the night. The sun was a red smear on the horizon as they split up, Nora leading the prisoner toward town, Maya racing toward the threatened homesteads, and Caleb and Evelyn turning their weary horses back toward the dark, ominous shape of the dam. The wind had shifted again, and now it carried a strange, damp smell up from the valley floor, the scent of earth and hidden water, a premonition of the flood to come. "We have to save the people first," Caleb said, his voice a low growl against the wind. "Yes," Evelyn answered, her hand still on the silver pendant. "Then we deal with Silas Crow." The moon was a cold, silver coin in a sky washed clean by the dust storm. An unnatural quiet had fallen over the land, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. Then the first explosion came, a deep, guttural roar from the direction of the dam that shook the very ground. Before the echo had died, a second blast followed, and then a third. A rapid, catastrophic chain of detonations that sounded like the world tearing itself apart. A moment of stunned silence, and then a new sound began. A low, grinding rumble that grew with terrifying speed into the roar of a monster awakening. A section of the Willow Creek Dam, the proud monument to Silas Crow's ambition, had been ripped away. A wall of dark water, studded with splintered timber and chunks of rock, surged into the narrow valley below. It was not a creek anymore. It was an indiscriminate beast, and it was hungry. The valley became a landscape of desperate, frantic action. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness as the families Maya had warned scrambled for the safety of the ridges. Caleb was already at the narrowest point of the canyon, where a massive log jam of debris fence posts, uprooted trees, the carcass of a steer had formed a secondary, unintentional dam. The floodwater, blocked by the jam, was being forced sideways, straight toward a small cluster of homesteads that had thought they were safe. A thick steel cable, used during the dam's construction and never removed, was holding the entire mass together. Caleb scrambled across the treacherous, shifting debris, a woodsman's axe in his hand. The water churned around his legs, pulling at him with a deadly, insistent force. He began to chop at the thick hemp ropes that lashed the cable to a massive boulder, the axe strokes falling with a desperate, rhythmic fury. Further downstream, Evelyn was on horseback, her face a pale oval in the moonlight. She had been helping a family load their wagon when the flood hit, separating the parents from their two small children, who were huddled in the wagon bed. The water was rising fast, swirling around the wagon wheels. Without a second's hesitation, Evelyn unhitched the family's terrified draft horses and attached the traces to her own saddle horn. "Hold on," she screamed to the children. Her horse strained, its hooves slipping in the slick mud, but it found its footing and began to pull the heavy wagon, inch by agonizing inch, toward the sloping safety of higher ground. From a high bluff overlooking the chaos, Sheriff Nora Bell was trying to bring order to the madness. She had organized the evacuation points, her voice a calm, commanding presence in the night. She saw Caleb, a small, solitary figure hacking away at the log jam. Then she saw the problem. The steel cable he was trying to free was snagged high up on an iron hook embedded in the canyon wall, a piece of forgotten equipment. Caleb was too low. He would never be able to reach it. The water was rising around him, and the logjam was groaning, threatening to break apart and take him with it. Nora raised her rifle. She braced it against a rock, took a steadying breath, and sighted down the barrel. It was an impossible shot in the dark, at a target no bigger than a man's fist. The first shot sparked off the rock an inch from the hook. She adjusted, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger again. The second shot hit the iron hook with a high-pitched metallic shriek, and the cable sprang free. With a sound like a giant sigh, the entire logjam shifted, broke apart, and surged down the main channel, away from the threatened homes. Caleb, clinging to a stable log, was carried with it for a moment before he could scramble back to the canyon side. Amid the rescue, Silas Crow was making his escape. He saw his plan turning to ruin, his monument collapsing, and he thought only of himself. He spurred his horse toward the one remaining escape route, the narrow spillway bridge that crossed the top of what was left of the dam. He found Caleb waiting for him in the middle of the bridge, a silhouette against the moonlit, churning water. Crow pulled his horse to a skidding halt. "Get out of my way, Mercer." "It's over, Crow," Caleb said, his voice flat. "This is everyone's water." Crow's hand dropped to the pistol on his hip. "I'll kill you where you stand." Caleb's own pistol was in his hand in a blur of motion. The two men faced each other, the roar of the flood filling the space between them. Caleb's gaze flickered for a fraction of a second to a small shed just beyond the bridge, the one where the reserve barrels of lamp oil were stored. One stray shot, one spark, and the whole place would go up in another fireball. He made a choice. He deliberately lowered his pistol and let it fall to the wooden planks of the bridge. The move surprised Crow, but he recovered quickly, a sneer twisting his lips as he dismounted and drew his own weapon. He never got to use it. Caleb closed the distance in the 2 long strides. Grabbing Crow's gun hand and twisting, the pistol fired, the bullet whining harmlessly into the night sky before it was wrenched from Crow's grip. They fell to the bridge in a desperate, clumsy struggle. It was not a clean fight. It was a brawl, fueled by righteous fury and desperate self-preservation. They rolled across the wet planks, their fists finding their marks, the sound of their grunts and curses lost in the noise of the flood. The struggle carried them to the edge of the bridge, near the spot where the dam had been blasted away. Caleb slammed Crow against the railing, which splintered under the impact. Crow, in a panic, shoved back and lost his footing on the slick wood. He screamed, a high, thin sound of terror, as he slipped over the edge, his fingers scrabbling for a hold. He managed to grab a splintered support beam, and there he hung, dangling over the churning, black water, his body swinging precariously in the wind. Just then, a flash of lightning illuminated the entire scene with a stark, blue-white light. In that instant, Evelyn, having delivered the children to safety, arrived at the foot of the bridge. She was holding something up, a fragile square of glass. It was one of her photographic negatives. As the lightning flashed again, the image was projected for a moment against the dark sky, a clear picture of the dynamite crates in the cave. And on the side of each one, illuminated in reverse, was the embossed, unmistakable seal of the Crow and Company. Nora, coming up behind her, saw it too. "That's it," she breathed. "That's the proof." Crow, hanging by his fingertips, saw them. He saw the evidence in Evelyn's hand, saw the sheriff, saw the faces of the townspeople who were beginning to gather, drawn by the confrontation. His arrogance shattered. "Help me," he shrieked. "For God's sake, help me!" Evelyn looked at the man who had tried to destroy her, who had ruined her brother, who had nearly condemned a valley full of innocent people to death. She saw the raw, pathetic terror in his eyes. She dropped the photographic plate into Nora's hands and uncoiled the rescue rope that was still tied to her saddle. With a strong, fluid motion, she threw it. The loop landed perfectly, just within Crow's reach. It was an act of pure, unhesitating humanity, a refusal to become the monster he was. Clinging to the rope, suspended between life and death, Silas Crow broke. The confession came pouring out of him, a torrent of words as unstoppable as the flood below. "It was me," he sobbed, his voice cracking. "I hired the men at the pass. I spread the rumors about Vale. I was going to blow the old channel, bury the spring, take all the water. It was all me." The whole town heard him. They stood in the moonlight, silent witnesses to the ugly, unraveling truth. Nora walked to the edge of the bridge and, with Caleb's help, hauled the sputtering, weeping man back onto solid ground. The snap of the handcuffs closing around his wrists was a small, final sound. The rescue was over. The immediate danger had passed. Caleb turned to Evelyn, who stood there, her face streaked with mud, her clothes soaked, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. He stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against him, his face buried in her damp hair. The chaos, the fear, the fight, it all fell away. Amid the roar of the broken dam and the gathering crowd, there was only this small, quiet space of safety. "You're safe now," he murmured into her hair. The words a promise he had been fighting all night to keep. As if on cue, the sky opened, the wind died down, and a gentle, steady rain began to fall. It was not the angry, dust-filled wind of the storm, but a clean, life-giving rain. It washed the soot from the air and the blood from the bridge. The scent of wet earth, the smell of hope, rose up from the thirsty ground to meet it. The dust had finally settled. That night, the schoolhouse became a sanctuary. The rescued families huddled in blankets near the warmth of the pot-bellied stove. The children, their fear giving way to a weary curiosity, lay on pallets, their eyes wide. Evelyn sat among them, her quiet voice telling them stories of the constellations, turning the distant, cold stars into friendly patterns. And Caleb stood watch at the door, a silent guardian, the new, fragile shape of a community forming in the warm light behind him. The morning after the flood broke not with the fury of the storm, but with a quiet, weeping sky. A gentle rain fell, washing the last of the red dust from the air and turning the ravaged valley into a glistening landscape of mud and sorrow. The roar of the broken dam had subsided to a steady, powerful murmur. The sound of a wild thing returned to its natural course. In Sheriff Nora Bell's office, justice was a quiet, weary affair. There was no formal courtroom, just a collection of exhausted people gathered around her desk. Silas Crow sat slumped in a chair. The bluster and arrogance washed out of him, leaving a hollow, gray-faced man. Tully Pike, his arm in a sling, stared at the floor, his bravado gone. On the desk lay the evidence, Evelyn's photographic plates, the scorched pages of the ledger, and the signed confessions of both men, written out in Nora's clear, steady hand. Silas Crow's confession, taken as he was pulled from the edge of the dam, had been witnessed by half the town, coupled with Tully's fearful corroboration. It was an ironclad case. "The territorial marshal will be here in 2 days," Nora said, her voice flat with a lack of sleep. "He'll be escorting you both to Helena for trial." Silas looked up, his eyes pleading. It was a business matter. "Sheriff, it just got out of hand." Nora's expression didn't soften. "You tried to steal this valley's future and were willing to wash away its people to cover your tracks. That's more than a business matter. That's a reckoning." The town watched in silence as the two men were led to the jail cells. There was no jeering, no triumphant shouts, just a profound, communal weariness and the quiet turning of a page. Later that day, Nora found Evelyn in the schoolhouse, sweeping muddy footprints from the floor. She held a telegraph flimsy in her hand. "I sent an inquiry about your brother," Nora said, her voice gentle. Evelyn stopped sweeping, her hands tightening on the broom handle. She nodded, unable to speak. "I got a reply from the federal marshal's office," Nora continued, choosing her words carefully. "Jasper Vale died 3 weeks ago. He was assigned to a railroad work crew in the Wyoming Territory. The official report lists the cause of death as a labor accident, a rock slide." She paused. "There are no other details. The file is closed." The news landed not with a crash, but with a quiet, heavy finality. There would be no dramatic rescue, no tearful reunion, no clearing of his name. There was only the stark, unvarnished tragedy of a life cut short and buried under a bureaucratic footnote. Evelyn stood very still for a long time, the world seeming to shrink to the small, silent space of the classroom. She did not cry. The tears for Jasper had been shed long ago, in private, lonely moments. What she felt now was a deep, aching grief, but it was a clean grief, unburdened by the frantic hope and the terrible weight of the unknown. He was gone. The chase was over. That afternoon, the mother of the boy Caleb had rescued from the fire came to the schoolhouse. She was the same woman who had demanded Evelyn's dismissal at the hearing. She stood in the doorway, twisting a bonnet in her hands, her face a mixture of shame and gratitude. "Miss Hart," she began, her voice low. "What I said at the hearing, I was wrong. I was scared. We were all scared." She took a deep breath. "We'd be honored if you'd consider staying, not just for the rest of the term, for good." It was the first of many such visits. People came with apologies, with gifts of food from their flood-damaged pantries, with offers to help repair the schoolhouse porch. The next day, a formal petition was delivered by Reverend Hale, signed by every parent in Silver Butte, officially offering her the permanent position of town school teacher. And that evening, Hattie Hale came by and, with a quiet smile, took the old, embroidered kitchen towel from Evelyn's room and hung it on a small nail inside the classroom door. "So everyone knows this is a home," she said. The work of survival began. The flood had permanently altered the course of Willow Creek, and the newly flowing water, a gift from the deep spring Crow had tried to bury, was in danger of washing away what was left of the pastures. Under Caleb's direction, The men of the town worked together, their shovels and sweat digging a new, secondary channel to irrigate the fields. It was hard, back-breaking work, but there was no complaining. They were not just moving earth. They were rebuilding their future, one shovelful at a time. The day the water was finally diverted into the new channel, Caleb made an announcement. "My land runs closest to the new springhead," he said, speaking to the assembled group of ranchers. "I'm setting aside an acre for a new community, well, one that nobody can own and nobody can shut off." The town was changing. The hard lessons of the drought and the flood were being learned. Evelyn felt herself changing with it. She had arrived as Evelyn Vale, a name she wore like a disguise, a constant, fearful reminder of the past she was running from. But the people here, in their anger and their forgiveness, had called her Miss Hart. They had stood with her and against her under that name. When Caleb had faced down Tully Pike at the fair, he had defended Miss Hart. When she had thrown the rope to Silas Crow, it was Miss Hart's compassion that had saved him. The name was no longer a shield. It was a skin she had grown into. It was hers. Her camera, which had been her weapon, her tool for uncovering a dark truth, also found a new purpose. She took it out into the recovering town and began to document not the conspiracy, but the community. She photographed the men digging the new channel, their faces streaked with mud and determination. She photographed the women organizing a communal kitchen in the church basement. She photographed the children, their resilience a bright, unquenchable flame, as they helped clear debris, their laughter returning to the valley. Her camera was no longer a box of secrets, but a box of memories, the shared history of a town that had been broken and was now, together, healing itself. The rescue rope, which Caleb had retrieved from the dam, now hung coiled on a peg in his barn, a quiet reminder that the same tool used for capture could also be used to save, a testament to the choices a man makes. The return of a fragile normalcy brought with it the return of gentle humor. The children, especially, seemed to feel the change. One afternoon, as Caleb was delivering a new load of firewood to the schoolhouse, little Sarah, the girl with the braids, looked up at him with a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Mr. Mercer," she called out, loud enough for the whole class to hear, "are you still looking at Miss Hart that way?" A ripple of giggles went through the classroom. Caleb, caught in the act of stacking logs, felt a familiar heat rise in his neck. Evelyn, who was writing on the blackboard, turned, a small, amused smile playing on her lips. Caleb cleared his throat, a slow grin spreading across his own face. "All right, that's it," he declared, setting the last log down with a thud. "Pop quiz for the whole class. A horse has 4 legs. Every leg has 1 hoof. Every hoof has 6 nails. How many nails in my barn?" A chorus of groans and laughter filled the room as the children scrambled for their slates, the shadow of the flood momentarily forgotten in the simple joy of a shared joke. That evening, a quiet rhythm of domesticity settled over them. They sat on the porch of his small ranch house, the air cool and smelling of rain-washed pine. He was grooming one of his horses. The rhythmic pull of the curry comb, a soothing, repetitive sound. She was sitting in a rocker, a needle and thread in her hands, mending a tear in the shoulder of the shirt he had worn during the fight on the bridge. They talked not of the future in grand, abstract terms, but in the small, practical language of survival and responsibility. They talked of the price of seed for the spring planting, of how much lumber would be needed to build a small library in a corner of the schoolhouse, of which families had been hit the hardest by the flood, and how the community could help them through the winter. It was a conversation grounded in the realities of their life, a quiet weaving together of their concerns and their hopes. Their affection for each other was not in grand declarations, but in these shared, practical details, in the quiet comfort of simply being together. Later, as Evelyn was leaving, Caleb walked her to her horse. The stars were out, bright and clear in the clean night air. "Thank you for the mending," he said. "It's the least I could do," she replied. "You saved my life." "We saved each other," he said, and the simple truth of it hung in the air between them. The next day, Caleb found Hattie Hale kneading bread in the church kitchen. He accepted a cup of coffee and sat with her for a while, talking about the rebuilding efforts. Then, with a casualness that he did not feel, he motioned toward her hand. "That's a fine ring, Hattie," he said. She looked down at the simple, worn silver band on her finger. "Amos and I have had these since the day we were married," she said, her voice soft with memory. "Had them made by a silversmith in Virginia City. Simple, but strong, like a good marriage, I suppose." Caleb nodded, turning his coffee cup in his hands. He looked at the ring, at its plain, unadorned surface, a symbol of a love that had weathered countless droughts and storms. "Did that smith make any others like it?" he asked, his voice quiet. The day they dedicated the new community well was a Sunday, and it felt like the first real Sunday Silver Butte had seen in a very long time. The sky was a high, clear blue, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of damp earth and baking bread across the town square. There was no formal ceremony, just a gathering. Families brought dishes to share, spreading them out on long trestle tables, baked beans and cornbread, roast chicken and apple pies. It was a feast of survival, a potluck of gratitude. Old Ben, his one good eye bright with emotion, rang the bell from the smithy, not the solemn toll of a church service, but a joyful, rhythmic peal that echoed off the mountains. The children, scrubbed and dressed in their best clothes, stood by the new stone wellhead and sang a simple song of thanks, their high, clear voices the sound of the town's future. Evelyn stood with her camera, her heart full. A few days earlier, Caleb had presented her with a new tripod, one he had made himself from seasoned oak, its joints smooth and its legs sturdy. "A proper artist needs proper tools," was all he'd said. Now, she was using it to take a photograph of the entire town gathered around the well. She arranged the shot, her head under the dark cloth. As she looked through the lens, she saw the faces of Silver Butte, no longer pinched with fear and suspicion, but open and relaxed in the autumn sunlight. She saw the Hales and Nora Bell standing with a rare, small smile on her face, and old Ben with his arm around his grandson. She asked them all to look at the camera, and as they did, she saw Caleb move into the frame. He didn't stand beside her or directly behind her. He stood off to the side, a part of the community, but not in her shadow, a quiet, supportive presence. She squeezed the bulb, and the shutter clicked, capturing the moment. As people began to eat, Maya Running Deer approached Evelyn. She carried a small bundle wrapped in soft buckskin. "This was sent from the rail camp in Wyoming," Maya said, her voice low. "It was with your brother's things." Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she took the package. She stepped away from the crowd, seeking the quiet shade of the schoolhouse porch. She unwrapped the buckskin to find a few simple possessions, a worn pocket knife, a tarnished silver dollar, and a small, stiff piece of card. On the card, in Jasper's familiar, hurried scrawl, were a few words. It said, "Evelyn, live your own name. Don't live in my shadow." She read the words again and again, a quiet wave of release washing over her. It was a final gift from her brother, a key unlocking the last door of the prison she had built for herself. He was freeing her, not just from his troubles, but from the weight of his memory. He was giving her permission to be simply, wholly, Evelyn Hart. She was so lost in the moment that she didn't notice little Sarah standing before her until the girl spoke. "Miss Hart," Sarah asked, her head cocked to one side. She looked over at Caleb, who was talking with Reverend Hale, and then back at Evelyn, a mischievous smile lighting up her face. "Does Mr. Mercer still look at you that way? Or does he look at anyone else like that now?" Evelyn laughed, a real, unburdened sound. Before she could answer, Caleb, who had overheard, turned around. He caught Sarah's eye and pressed his lips together to hide a smile. "Only the ones who make me forget what I was about to say," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet afternoon air. This time, he wasn't flustered. He was stating a fact. A warm, appreciative laugh rippled through the adults who had heard. A shared, public acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged in the heart of their crisis. That evening, as the last of the families drifted home, Caleb found Hattie Hale. He had a small, tarnished silver ring in the palm of his hand. One Hattie had given him, a near twin to her own that the old Virginia City Smith had made years ago. "I need to make it shine," he said, his voice low and serious. Hattie smiled. "Then you need to talk to old Ben. He knows the old ways." Caleb found the blacksmith banking the fire in his forge for the night. He showed him the ring. Ben held it up to his good eye, turning it over and over. "Good silver," he grunted. "Honest. Needs an honest shine." He didn't use any modern polishes. Instead, he took a soft leather cloth and dipped it in a small pot of sheep fat. Then he sprinkled a fine, gray powder onto the fat. "Wood ash," he explained, "from a hardwood fire. It's gentle, but it finds the truth in the metal." He handed the cloth to Caleb. "Don't rush it. You have to work it in. Slow and steady. You're not just cleaning it. You're warming it up for its new life." Caleb sat on a stool beside the glowing forge and began to polish the ring. The slow, circular motions, a meditation in the gathering twilight. As the sun began to set, the peaks of the Beartooth Mountains were bathed in a warm, honey-colored light. A cool breeze drifted down from the high country, carrying the clean, rich smell of wet earth and pine. Hope was no longer a fragile wish. It was a tangible presence, a color in the sky, a scent on the wind. He found Evelyn by the newly cut channel, where the water from the deep spring now ran, clear and steady. They walked together along the bank, their horses trailing behind them. The only sound the gentle murmur of the water and the crunch of their boots on the damp ground. "I had a worse day of my life," Caleb said, his voice quiet and reflective, breaking a long, comfortable silence. "It was years ago, when I was scouting. I watched a good man get betrayed by a superior officer, and I stood by and said nothing. I followed my orders and held my tongue. The silence has been a weight on me ever since." He stopped and turned to face her, the golden light of the sunset full on his face. "And then I had a best day," he continued. "It was at the harvest fair. The whole town was watching. And Tully Pike tried to put a stain on your name. And I stood up and said, 'Here, we call her Miss Hart.' In that moment, saying those words out loud, I felt that old weight lift. It was the best day of my life because it was the day I finally found my voice again. You gave that back to me, Evelyn." The raw honesty in his voice was a profound gift. She felt her throat tighten. "I've been thinking," he went on, his gaze turning to the future, "about the schoolhouse. I was wondering if you might want a small library in the corner. I could contribute the wood and the labor." She looked at the stream, at the bare, muddy banks. "I was thinking of planting willows here," she said, her voice soft, fast-growing ones. "So the children have a place to sit in the shade. So they have a landmark to remember this by. Not the flood, but the first trees that grew after." They stood there for a moment, their separate dreams weaving together into a shared vision. He reached out and took her hand. His fingers were warm and strong around hers. He held the newly polished silver ring in his other hand, but he made no move to offer it. He just held her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "Evelyn," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't try to hide. He looked into her eyes, and she saw a future there. A lifetime of shared work and quiet evenings. He didn't kneel. He didn't make a grand speech. He simply said, "When you're ready, I'll be waiting." The next Sunday morning, the small church in Silver Butte was full. Simple white cloths were draped over the altar and the window sills, a symbol of a town washed clean. After the opening hymn, the children of the school, led by little Sarah, stood at the front in a clear, proud voice. Sarah read from a piece of paper, a letter of thanks they had written themselves, addressed to their teacher, Miss Hart, for her courage, for her kindness, and for not running away when things got hard. Reverend Hale did not deliver a fire and brimstone sermon. He spoke quietly, his voice filled with a weary wisdom. He spoke of water, of how it could be a source of life or a force of destruction, and how the choice often belonged to men. He spoke of justice, not as a tool of vengeance, but as a necessary rebalancing of a world knocked crooked by greed. And he spoke of forgiveness, not as a forgetting of wrongs, but as the difficult, necessary work of setting down the burden of anger so that a community could walk into its future with its hands free to build. After the service, the entire town seemed to drift toward the new community well, the symbol of their shared future. People stood in quiet, sunlit groups, the feeling of hope a palpable thing in the air. Caleb found Evelyn standing by the wellhead, her hand resting on the cool, damp stone. He walked over to her, and the crowd, sensing a private moment, gave them a respectful space. He stood before her for a moment, the whole world seeming to fall away. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, he knelt on one knee in the damp earth. The town held its breath. He held the simple, shining silver ring in the palm of his hand, offering it to her. "Evelyn," he said, his voice clear and steady, meant for her but heard by all. "I cannot promise you that every day will be sunny, but I promise to share the water, to share the work, and to share the laughter until we are old." She didn't speak. She didn't cry. The answer was in the way she looked at him, a look of such profound and certain love that it needed no words. She knelt down in front of him and pulled him into a fierce, tight embrace, and as she held him, she nodded her head against his shoulder. A silent, powerful yes. A cheer went up from the children. The teacher said yes, Sarah shouted, and the cheer was taken up by their parents, a wave of pure, uncomplicated joy that washed over the small gathering. Later that afternoon, the town presented them with a gift. It was a large, leather-bound ledger, its pages clean and empty. "For the new library," Reverend Hale said, his eyes shining. It was more than a book. It was a promise, an investment in the future they were all building together, a future built on knowledge and community. Word came from Helena the following week. Silas Crow had been tried and convicted. The fines levied against his company were substantial, and the territorial court had decreed that a portion of the money was to be used to properly re-engineer the damaged dam, making it a public utility under the supervision of Sheriff Nora Bell. Justice was not just a closed cell. It was a broken thing made right. Life settled into a new, hopeful rhythm. Evelyn took her camera to the banks of the new channel and photographed Caleb as he helped her plant the first of the willow saplings. Caleb, in turn, built a sturdy bench from pine and placed it beneath the small, hopeful trees. The rescue rope, the one she had thrown to Silas Crow, now hung neatly coiled on a peg in Caleb's barn, its purpose transformed forever from a tool of capture to an instrument of salvation. One evening, as they sat on the bench, watching the water flow by, he turned to her with a familiar, thoughtful expression. He smiled. "You know," he said, his voice a low, teasing rumble, "you still make me forget what I was about to say." She leaned her head on his shoulder, a contented smile on her face. "Good," she replied softly. "That means we will have plenty of things to write down in the library ledger." The days shortened, and the evenings grew cool. Their life together was built not on dramatic moments, but on the small, sturdy bricks of daily life. It was in the way he brought her a cup of coffee in the morning before she left for the schoolhouse, and the way she mended his work shirts in the evening. It was a life of shared burdens and quiet companionship. One night, they sat on the porch of his ranch house, which was now their ranch house, eating a simple supper of baked beans and cornbread. The air smelled of pine in the coming winter. Old Ben sat on the steps, his back against a post, playing a soft, mournful tune on his harmonica. Sheriff Nora was there too, leaning back in a chair, a cup of coffee in her hands, a rare, relaxed smile on her face. For the first time in years, she looked as if the weight of the world was not resting entirely on her shoulders. Love in the West, Evelyn thought, was not about flowery words or grand gestures. It was about how people chose to share the little water they had. It was about knowing that while courage was needed to demand justice, only compassion could hold a community together for the long haul. It was about the quiet, daily proof that a family could be chosen, built not from blood, but from shared work and mutual respect. As the last of the light faded from the sky, Evelyn brought out her camera. She set it on its new oak tripod. Facing the porch, she wanted to remember this moment, this feeling of profound and hard-won peace. She lit a small magnesium flash strip and stood beside Caleb, his arm warm and solid around her waist. The camera flashed, a brief, brilliant star in the twilight, capturing the image of the Silver Butte family. It captured the new well standing sturdy in the background, the new creek murmuring in the darkness, the small willow sapling holding fast to the earth, and the man and woman who were about to be married, standing together, their faces turned toward the future. The dust had settled. The future was open. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment with where you are tuning in from to connect with fellow listeners. And please consider subscribing to Wild West Night, liking the video, and pressing the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.